Welcome to Speak Sex. I'm your host, Eurydice. It's June 7th, new moon. It's the 8-month anniversary of Gaza, and today's guest is Freeman. She's the author of Disobedient Girl on Solomon Lane. She's a writer, critic, and academic from Sri Lanka. Welcome to the podcast room.
I'm glad to be here. I do want to mention, since we're talking about Gaza, that I'm also, and probably I'm more proud of this, the editor of Extraordinary Rendition, American Writers on Palestine, which came out a few years ago.
Yes.
With, for me, a significant contribution to the conversation about Palestine,
Yes.
Particularly in the literary world for us, those of us who are in that small world.
Yes, thank you for mentioning it. That's why I come to you today. That's very specifically because you have huge amount of knowledge, and you have been recently working for the United Palestinian Appeal, you said, the UPA?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, I'm working for UPA, and UPA is a 46-year-old organization, but I will note that, my comments here are my own, and they are not endorsed or to be taken to be endorsed by UPA. Just for the
I want to give your voice a platform, my platform, and I want to hear from you how you see the war, the occupation, the genocide, the conversations about the ceasefire. Personally, I'm still kind of shell-shocked from everything that has happened since 2021, since the Ukraine war, really, until now. All the escalations feel like we're thrown back to a 20th century way of being, which is war-centered. We're no longer post-historical, as our global corporate elites, had insisted that we had been for a minute. Since the campus protests, I felt less despair, and that allowed me to want to come to you and speak to you about this in public. So I'd love to hear anything that you want to tell me and my audience about the reality of what's happening on the ground in Palestine.
It's interesting you talk about, it's not only, it's the protests, it's what's going on there, it's what's going on around the world. I mean, the crackdown offers around the world, but also conversations. I mean, in some ways, difficult though it is and exhausting though it sometimes can feel, but you never want to say that my struggle to consider these events and talk about them is too much, because you always consider, or I consider, what people inside Palestine, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where there have been huge amounts of repression, violence inflicted upon Palestinians, are undergoing. In comparison, me sitting at my desk on a blustery, sort of warm summer day, looking out on greenery and the FedEx truck driving by is not, it cannot be equated with the kind of exhaustion that they must be feeling. When just today, just before I got on this, I saw that the UN-run Asma school in Shati refugee camp in northern Gaza was bombed.
Wow.
That is the school since yesterday. Israel and please invert, add the inverted commas around both those things, bombed another UN school in central Gaza in Nusayrat, killing at least 40 people, including 12 women and children. And what is interesting is, non-progressive, non-left source than CNN reported that the weapons used were made in America. They were GBU 39s, and they were also used in Rafah on the 26th of May. The line to the death and destruction that is being inflicted upon people there is very clearly back home, again within inverted commas here. You consider all of those things. You consider the fact that as of today, 36,379 people have been murdered, and those are the people who have been identified. So many people who are under rubble, who are missing, and whose family members presume they're dead but don't want to assume that they're dead, because that is such an amount of staggering grief. All 600,000 odd children in Rafah were malnourished. Now they are fleeing to Khan Yunis. They've been running from pillar to post inside that tiny area, which is about the distance from Northampton to Amherst in Massachusetts. 100% of all the universities are bombed, all 13 public libraries, 150 years of history in the Central Archives of Gaza have been bulldozed, turned into rubble. We have this ludicrousness of a floating pier being built on
the floating pier. Oh my God.
The floating pier was actually recently washed away, parts of it into the ocean. And the fact that there are trucks lined up for miles that are filled with goods and supplies, medicine and aid, which is, instead of getting that aid in, the United States is like, oh, we can't really disturb we can't really trouble them, or we've got to build a floating pier on the ocean where these people are not allowed to fish. They are fishermen, the Palestinian people in Gaza. So it is very hard. Someone was saying recently, for any sort of sentient being with like functioning intellect, to look at all of this and look at all of the facts, not see the truth of things, and sort of accept this other, like, Hamas conversation that is going on. If you think about it, you mentioned the ceasefire. There have been, on October 9th, there was one that there was Hamas offered, and since October 9th there have been many ceasefires, and the language has been shaped by Hamas, and they have not been accepted by the United States and Israel within Hamas. So this whole idea of now there's a ceasefire,
and they're not accepted for what reason? They just don't want to they don't want to have a permanent ceasefire. That's why.
Israel does not want a ceasefire. I mean, the reason why the ICJ has ruled that it's the probable cause of genocide is because the intention is that it is not a ceasefire. It is not leaving Palestine and certainly people inside Gaza a viable environment in which they can conduct life. If that is the intention.
So the stated intention is to eliminate Hamas, which is of course extremely abstract. When you're dealing with a guerrilla force, a resistance force, it could be every other person who lives there. I think the misunderstanding really, to me, that guerrilla liberation movement is part and parcel of the identity of most of the people. So when you say eliminate Hamas, which is that's the official stated goal, they don't say just kill all the leaders or something concrete like that. So it does seem that becomes a kind of greater genocidal aim, because what is Hamas, what is a non-Hamas Palestinian, and who gets to make that decision, and especially from holding guns with the muzzle of a gun turned against them. That's such an abstraction that really it's an impossible task, the so-called elimination of Hamas.
Yeah.
And I feel that unfortunately people's consciousness, I think, is anesthetized by movies and videos and video games and news streams and all of that, where violence is also the main source of entertainment. So I think, and that is specifically used to confuse us, to make people confuse the horror of war with a form of fun, so that they would view evil as commonplace. If it's away, if it's not in their house. I think that's why most people do not pay and will not pay urgent, serious attention until there is some sort of huge sacrifice.
Definitely. I mean, the point that you make. Who is Hamas?
Yeah.
It's a very, very. It's a claim you can. Am I Hamas? Are you Hamas? Because we must be, because we're talking about genocide. We must be Hamas. This is a very fluid thing that can be attached to everybody, no matter where they are. It can be attached to the 70-something-year-old professor from Dartmouth, who's a Jewish scholar who was thrown to the ground by the police.
Mm-hmm.
It can be attached to anybody. And when you think about it, you may have seen one of the latest, most horrifying images of a father holding his 18-month-old son whose
Yes.
head was not found, and the brothers who are, sitting there crying. Was he Hamas? Was this 18-month-old boy Hamas?
Oh boy.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
are the
Mm-hmm.
12 children who were part of the latest bombing of the school Hamas? Well,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you could say they were, because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
certainly, they are, like you said, you cannot be a liberation movement, the movement of people who are striving for freedom from an oppressive regime, wherever it is found, it is the liberation of a whole people. It is not the liberation of a few people. That is how we define our struggles. This is why, like tomorrow, there's a march to DC from all over the United States. It is not just a few people who have some opinions, but people representing many communities, many ethnicities, many states, many genders, and all kinds of demographics who are marching there. They are all part of that movement, and they could all be branded as Hamas. This system that we're in now, when, say, the ICJ rules that and issues arrest warrants, and people say, well, we don't believe in the ICJ, so we won't observe that. It's like if someone commits a crime in Philadelphia or Brooklyn and says, well, I don't really believe in the police, well, so I can't be arrested. It's as absurd as that. But somehow we act like this is okay. News media rolls on with its bizarre narratives, assuming that people like you and I reading this and believing it. But the fact is, we aren't. You aren't. I am not. And there are many, many people who don't. You mentioned young people and how they look at video games and things like that. But I think actually in this case, the young people are at the forefront of understanding that there is a distinct difference between the video games they're playing and the war that is happening,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
they are the ones. And that their protests, I think, are significant because, for instance, in UCLA, when the students were protesting, when you think about who was brought out against them, it was the LAPD, the LA Sheriff's Department, the California Highway Patrol, the UCPD, and Marjanem. It's a Zionist Israeli occupation force trained security team working with the LAPD. There was an Israeli special ops vet organizer named Aaron Cohen. When you think about all those forces that were brought out against young people who probably play video games on, in their off time when they're not protesting genocide, it's very significant. How much force is being arrayed against young people, because there's a young activist, Jamila Jones. She's on Instagram as at Sunny Day Jones, and she recorded this little reel for young people who are protesting maybe for the first time. And there's many interesting things she says there, but she also says something I found very succinctly put, and that is that there are three kinds of protests that America has and always will use its full force to stop: labor protests for Black rights and anti-war protests, and that protesting genocide in Palestine is actually all three of those things, which is why the suppression has been so violent and so instantaneous. And conversely, the support for the people who are perpetrating that kind of violence on young people, on people exercising the freedom of speech. For instance, University of Massachusetts in Amherst. This is a public university, and there was so much protest unleashed upon people. There's an article by Kevin Young and Chris Uppy. If you could Google them, both talking about being arrested, faculty being arrested on
Mm-hmm.
that campus, and the student body, the professors and faculty and librarians, 5 labor unions, all of these people passed votes of no confidence on the president and Reyes, and he's still there, and he's supported by the trustees, the board of trustees, and the chancellors, and all these people. Why? If every single demographic at the university has expressed a vote of no confidence in the leadership of the president, and he still remains in power. I mean, we shouldn't shy away from really sitting with that kind of
Yeah, well,
information.
it's the donor class. I mean, the money that supports the university, right? They make those decisions. So it's the same thing, like, who is making money off the weapons being used, and who is, manufacturing and trading weapons. I mean, all of that, I think he is, whoever the president is, he's probably beholden to the donor class, and they're always against the interests of the working class, basically everybody else. Because they don't want us to be like full real people. I think in their view of the world, like the small group of billionaires were like the soldiers, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they are the Olympian gods, and they use us to kind of like play their board games against each other.
Yeah. Well, if you allow yourself to be shifted, right? I mean, I think our solidarity also needs to be as unboarded as their currency. And
right, exactly. Yeah, that's nicely put. Yes.
The protests are signifying that is becoming the case more and more around the world. People uniting, and labor is uniting with students, uniting with BIPOC issues, and really making the connections regarding where the oppression comes from.
Yeah. Well, and I feel it always takes, a lot of bloodshed and suffering, and sacrifice for the reversal of, like our awareness of the awareness and the consciousness, of an entire people. So it's only when we have, a humanitarian crisis and these like huge numbers that didn't need to be lost, when we the people stop and pay closer attention. It takes many people who have nothing to lose and who are willing to die for a cause, for those outside, to begin to change the way they experience what's happening, because otherwise we just go by what we're told. So much of this is really where we get our information. So much of our understanding depends on our information sources, especially in times of conflict. Every conflict is always presented to us in the West as like localized, and the fault of like a small specific terrorist group, who are like the troublemakers. And if our people's, our side just annihilates them, then, the world will have peace again. We will have world peace again. The media are always like minimizing and oversimplifying, in the eyes of the public, this conflict, so that of us can't see the big picture of what's going on, cannot see like bigger struggle. We only see like a few details, rare close-ups.
Yeah, and I think because that propaganda has been so effective, it's very hard to combat it. So even though the actual facts on the ground are very simple, and they could be succinctly, put in terms of the occupation, in terms of the almost 76 years, the Nakba, and the different, all the things that have happened inside Palestine. They could be very easily summarized. But because there has been such an unleashing of propaganda that has laid the groundwork for this assault, for this particular genocide that is happening now, it's difficult. I had a conversation yesterday with a very dear friend, an incredibly smart woman, and she was saying, "Could you just tell me, like, what is happening? Just explain, what is happening." And unlike younger people who are, informing themselves and are alert to news coming from the ground and communicating with each other. And there is a population that doesn't either engage in that fashion or is so set in their ways that it's hard to break through all that propaganda that has settled in. So, for instance, I was explaining that we were sitting in a restaurant, and I said, okay, it's like there will be this Israeli narrative that, the Palestinians, we withdrew from the Gaza Strip, and look at them, they didn't really thrive, their businesses didn't flourish. What happened? Like, we let them do it. But they don't say we withdrew from the Gaza Strip and then we blockaded them and laid siege to them for 17 years. Their land, they have no access through land, no access through water, they can't even fish properly, no access by air. They bombed the airport, and their taxes are held by the Israelis. They have no autonomy over any decision that is made inside, except freedom of some movement, except when the Israelis decide to bomb them, which they did very frequently in those years. If you don't have that piece of information, yes, this narrative sounds very plausible. Wow, we let them, we withdrew, we took, and why aren't they thriving? So these conversations, this is what I mean by it could be exhausting, but these conversations are also important because you have to not just protest, you have to protest on every single front at all times. For students, one thing I find very interesting in what they're doing is not just students, actually, a lot of people who are protesting right now, they're wearing the kufiyeh, which, signifies the trade routes, the patterns on the kufiyeh, the fishing, which is the net pattern, and olive trees, which symbolize resilience and perseverance and strength in agriculture. And these are, the heart of Palestinian livelihoods. What is interesting is students are all wearing them, and it is a symbol of solidarity with Palestine, but it also dissolves artificial boundaries of gender, class, and various privileges into a single common statement against genocide, against this assault on humanity. But because they're wearing them, the police and the people who are being brought out to attack them can also just treat them as they've treated people whom they associate with that piece of clothing as terrorists. They can say, oh, they're all the same. They're all terrorists, and we can brutalize them, and that's fine. But I think it's very significant that students are refusing to hide their solidarity. They are doing something that is saying we are of one mind. We might be Jewish, we might be Palestinian, we might be from Sri Lanka, we might be from anywhere, we might be black, brown, or anything, but we are united in this, and this the signal of that.
Yeah, I feel that this false dualism of like if you're pro Gaza or at least pro peace, I don't know if you're an anti-Semite, these are like such false dualities, because many Israelis support the plight of the Gazan people, many Arabs are Semites. Like all of these identities, I think, are used to divide us, to divide the people. I think they're used by the powers that be to divide us, whether it's like religious differences or ethnic, sectarian. They are useful because they set us in antithesis with each other. Then we don't look out to see like the bigger picture. But when you describe this, I did have this thought as you were speaking about, the olive trees and the fishing and the lifestyle, the way of life and survival and sustenance, that there may be kind of a bigger connection there in the eyes of the young people around the world, or at least around the West, who support it, because you described Palestinian life as the non-corporate life.
Very much, yeah.
Right, a life that is regenerative and that is, eco-friendly, and that so. If you're going to make these abstract generalizations, which, really we shouldn't, but just in the big abstract picture, on one side, you have like the military industrial complex, you have like nuclear weapons, you have those things that the shield.
The Iron Dome.
The Iron Dome, this kind of like huge, automated, robotic, kind of like GPS and Wi-Fi dependent force that will spend tens of millions of dollars per bomb, when the other side has little drones. So yeah, I think that there is that bigger sense of the corporate state against the natural state, that bigger fight of like the people against the empires.
Yeah. And I mean, and this goes back again to what we were talking about earlier about the amount of the crackdown on protests and where that comes from. You mentioned, basically the 1%, which,
who by the way, like, profit from like the 80% of weapons that are being used in both of these wars and all the other wars.
And everywhere, and will continue to do so. And they're testing weapons inside Gaza. So, that has also been talked about and proven repeatedly. But also in terms of language, and I think resisting on this, so which is why, I know, if you say Palestine, if you say Gaza, if you say genocide, your posts might be monitored, but not. I do continue to say Palestine, and I continue to say Gaza, and I continue to say genocide, because this is what it is. And in ordinary language, I mean, when I did that anthology, that was part of what it was. Why can't we? What's wrong with? And also when, calling that anthology extraordinary rendition, people are like, well, that's only used for taking soldiers to Gaza, to Guantanamo, and taking enemy combatants, within inverted commas, to Guantanamo. But my feeling is, I'm not relinquishing the use of the word extraordinary rendition, which could mean an extraordinary rendition of support or speech to somebody else, because that's you lose when you do that. And for instance, right now, with a push to redefine what anti-Semitism is, in December they voted that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and in April,
the Congress, you mean?
In the Congress voted, and in April, 44 House members, 43 of them were Democrats, and there was one Republican voted against the resolution describing the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" as anti-Semitic. And then June 4th, this is 3 days ago, voted overwhelmingly to impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court because of their decision to seek arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. The vote was 247 to 155, and it was almost every Republican and a few dozen Democrats voting for it. Why, why is it that you're voting this way? You don't want to be held accountable for despicable acts that they are committing now, and you probably would be happy to commit when it's your time to do so, which is your time to do so absolutely here. I'm not saying doing it in Palestine, doing it here, because where is the accountability? If you destroy the one last remaining body that has any kind of moral sway, they have no jurisdiction necessarily, but moral sway over the world. So, we are in a different milieu altogether in where we are right now.
Yeah, I'm not saying this lightly, and it's not only about this issue with what's happening in Gaza, but I do think that this is a significant point in American history. It's a time of a mass pivot. I think a lot more will happen in 2024. I just feel it in my skin. I feel it. I don't think when it happens, it will happen because of a plan. It's just the pressures that we feel right now are just pretty extraordinary. The borders. One of the issues is, the stuff that gets to Hamas through tunnels underground. And is it going in, from Egypt? So there are very, very strict borders around the Palestinian people in Gaza. And there are strict borders, like Ukraine is fighting Russia over a couple of feet of borders, like they're willing to sacrifice 100,000 of their young men over this, what we used to think are obsolete ideas of control, of land control. But there are no borders for money. There is no borders for capital. Money now moves as it likes, and by money, then we must also mean, weapons. They move because weapons are like just one of the forms in which money materializes. And money moves through the world. Money seems to have definitely more human rights than humans.
Yeah.
I think that people are aware of that they can see that, we're all fighting about, how the borders that are still imposed on our bodies, and how our identities kind of define and limit our movement, our physical movement. But when it comes to financial movement, it's totally different. And even, and America has found out that, when it tried to take control with all of the sanctions, against Russia, it actually failed, right? So it led to the new effort to create an alternative, through BRICS. And we'll see how far that gets to go, whether they'll actually be allowed to make a currency, because if you remember, like that's what Saddam and Gaddafi wanted to do. And then lo and behold, like Iraq war, Libya, the Dick Cheneys of the world took advantage of 9/11 to make sure that no one would sell oil in anything but dollars. Money is money by definition is amoral, which in practice means it's immoral, right? Because if you are not ethical and moral, then in the real world, sooner or later, you're immoral, right? Because morality is something that prevents you from otherwise acting, according to naked greed. So, like, if we are anti-war, if we believe that any violence, no matter which side, no matter what the justification, and especially any like institutional, like militarized mass violence, which automatically creates like many more generations of violence. If we believe that that should be stopped, if we're against that, as I am very strongly, I feel that there is no justification. Then we have to consider this movement of capital and money. And why can't we put borders on that instead? Why can't we put limits to the movement of money so that the rich can use their money only to promote peace, so that the billionaires who have like all these extra funds don't make more funds of the suffering of people and the death of people, and instead are highly incentivized or forced to only pay for peace.
Well, I mean, I think that so when I look at the generation Gen Zs and in particular, and a lot of them, certainly in my little circles, really do have eschewed this idea of capital and 401k plans and that kind of stability, and are moving towards a different kind of way of life. And so restraining money is one thing, but of course we don't have the power to do that. And one thing I often point out is, like, during the BLM protests, for instance, there's always this narrative about, oh, there's people running around with guns, black people have guns, blah blah blah, but not one shot was fired by a black person against any of these heavily armed people from the state who were cracking down on people. These are national protests. The entire country was protesting. Where were the guns? They were in the hands of the powerful, which is the government and the police and the National Guard and all those people who were brought out against the people. And that is the same now. Those students at Columbia who were being attacked, not one of them pulled out a weapon and attacked anybody. They couldn't act in self-defense. They don't believe, you don't believe, I don't believe in that kind of response. It's non-violent by design, by their internal moral compass, which seems very lacking in these other people. But the way I think forward in that regard is to say, I'm not going to participate in this kind of exchange that is defined by very corporate, consumerist, capitalist yardsticks. So if I'm not measuring myself by those yardsticks, then I become a problem, right? Because if the only reason these things stand is because people buy into them.
Right. Without the consumer, there is no corporation.
There's no product. So if you barter, if you work communally, if you do, and people have done that. I mean, when you think about Move in Philadelphia, which was bombed, in a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood of Philadelphia, bombed because they decided they were not going to participate in this system, and they were going to be self-sufficient. And so it harkens back to what you said about, when we're talking about the Kufiyeh and agriculture and fishing, that is self-sufficiency. That is the ability to live. I mean, there was a news item, I think it was the New York Times, actually, of all things, that was talking about how Israel has declared that rainwater belongs to them, and it is illegal to collect rainwater. What the heck? It is ludicrous, it is laughable if it did not actually mean that people are dying on account of those kinds of things, on account of that kind of statement, which if stated in any of our circles, we would be greeted with mockery, is permitted as and encouraged and supported by taxpayer money from the United States and Britain and all these places. Resisting that system truly has to be a complete reversal of this notion of capitalism, but and something that emphasizes community and a more communal way of life,
Yeah.
which doesn't mean that people are not working and earning a living wage. It just means that we are more connected to one another and are living in some fashion that is not destructive, that is not dismantling our own and each other's humanity. These things are important, and I think there is this new generation that is actively doing that. If you look at the protests on the campuses, and I love looking at the graduations where student after student is walking across the stage holding up a Palestinian flag, holding up placards that say Columbia is funding genocide or Harvard is committing war crimes, and snatching their certificates, diplomas from the hands of whoever is, whatever puppet is handing them out, in a giant kind of fu to them, and saying, yeah, I'll take this, but I don't care. And there have been many interviews with young people who have said, when people ask them, don't you care about your job, don't you care about what's going on legal, like law students, for instance, and they have said, no, I actually don't. And you can't argue with that. You can't. How do you can't bully someone who says, I don't care about your system. You
Yeah.
can only
Yeah.
bully someone if you care about the system and you care about your little place in it. Then you can bully that person.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you're right.
so
Yeah, that's difficult because it will take some organization, but that's the way to get out from like that extractive, militarized, deadening capitalism that we were talking about, is to find alternatives, but really not one on one, not simply like you go off, live the van life, or
no,
organize it in some ways so that it becomes sustainable. That makes sense to me.
yeah. And I think that is happening more and more now. There have been a lot of the labor unions in the United States have joined in the Zionist protests and the pro-Palestinian protests. And I think that unification is very significant. In 1981, 13,000 air traffic controllers left their post. And unions really suffered because at that time the government said, "Oh my gosh, business will suffer, blah blah blah." But the fact is, and that was just for a few days, and they fired all 13,000 of those people. But if you actually look at the facts, so for instance, 9/11, uh, they we had for 2 days there was nothing, no flights in the skies. There was a pandemic for more than a year. There were no flights, and the fact is, airlines in North America continue to outperform their global competitors, and it was the
Wow.
first region to return to profits, which I don't believe in 2022, and leads again in 2023. And the United States, North America's projected airline net profits 14.3 billion for 2023 at a 4.2% net profit margin after a year of a pandemic where there were no flights. I mean, so the idea that somehow, if you strike, if you have a labor union, if you have this and that, then everybody's going to struggle. If there's a living wage, businesses are going out of it. This is bunkum. This is simply not true. And I think, yeah, so on the one hand, you have to reject that idea and stick to your principles when you protest, when you decide to walk out of something, when you decide to sign up for a vote of no confidence, when you decide to protest. All of these things, you stand and you continue to stand. And on the other hand, you reject this idea that this is the only way things can be done. So I think, and this I know is very dear to your heart and mine, is this idea that we must think about political issues and policies in a feminine
Mm-hmm.
framework,
Mm-hmm.
inclusive, that is encompassing, that is looking at all of
Mm-hmm.
the one.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
and that requires someone who actually embodies those principles and really is able to articulate that. That does not have to be a woman. It just has to be someone who is able to see that feminine energy and inclusiveness in how we look at the world. And
yeah, I feel that, for me, like in times of war, I immediately empathize with the mothers, and I think so do most mothers. The Palestinian mothers and the Israeli mothers, whose kids were like at the rave, the Ukrainian mothers, but also the Russian mothers, like in that sense, the suffering, the empathy for the mother, all understand a mother's love for her child. And when mothers lose their children, it kind of overcomes, that non-stop indoctrination that we're under, and we can feel like bigger than that. We can expand. Like it really doesn't matter which side of the war, which war. When you think about the young boys being killed, the young kids being killed, the mother whose grown sons are being sacrificed willingly and against their will, all of it. So yeah, I think that motherhood, but also in general, that our place in nature, which is bigger than like our cultural differences, like the human right to clean food, the human right to clean water, the human right to clean air, the human right to share free natural resources. All of that stuff, I think, is what you call feminine. And I think I do think is also a good place where we can all meet, because it's at the core of being human. So yeah, I think that it connects us. It doesn't divide us.
Yeah, no, definitely. But it's also, the how deeply these roots of this extractive, very masculine, very warlike positions run is demonstrated by the way that some women, who even some mothers, do not empathize with the women and mothers of others. And you think about this in terms of, and again, it's a parallel, because I'm now blanking on the name of but I'm sure you can Google it and find it, the hill in Palestine where Israelis gather to watch the bombing of Gaza, including mothers, with picnics.
Ouch. No, I didn't see that.
Yeah, in the same way that white people, including mothers with their children, went to watch lynchings with picnics. This is not this. So now we're getting into the whole realm of race and all of that. But the fact is that you have to have. It was one of the first poems I wrote when I first read about slave auctions and this idea of watching lynchings, and I couldn't understand. How can a woman, and I was a kid, I had no idea of, being a grown woman and a mother, but I still had this notion of how is it possible, if you're a woman and you are a mother, to watch children being ripped away from other mothers.
That's the power of culture. That's the power of like indoctrination, where it's so deep that it somehow like we can otherize our fellow humans. And that's when you have to fight first and foremost like these cultural stereotypes and demonizations of each other.
Yeah, but why do you and I resist it? How do you?
Yeah, I don't know.
So it's not beyond the ability of anybody to resist it.
No, it's not beyond the ability. Sometimes, a person's life, like we have crossed cultures, we left our culture young, we went and lived in other cultures, we saw how wildly different their point of view is, so it kind of gives you a sense that, wait, there are more than one ways of seeing everything. So if people are kept insulated, isolated, it's harder for them to get in and out, come out of that, point of view that they were acculturated into. If as soon as you start learning language, you learn only one meaning for each word, so like, good is like, white, bad is black, whatever that is,
Right.
And
right.
you have no access to a world outside like the narrow confines of your home or your neighborhood that would show you that actually the reverse is equally true, or maybe even more true.
Right.
Opening up, people's eyes to that in the end we overlap, that our humanity is greater than our differences, that we're all in need of mercy. We all sin just differently. Allowing space for less hatred is a place to go back to again and again, because the moment you wall following the hatred, then you create generations of that, and it's even harder to move forward out of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I like to believe that it is because you and I come from somewhere else, but it is our upbringing. The people who raised us this way, and we have gone on to raise our daughters.
Oh yeah.
So this is people pass the baton in different ways. Hatred and vice, and just corruption and prejudice are also batons that can be passed down, just as much as an open-mindedness and a compassion for people who are not like ourselves, and an acceptance of other people's beliefs and idea, like being able to see that if I believe something and I kneel, that it might be the same feeling that is raised in someone else's heart who kneels before a different God. These are things that we've been someone told that to us, and that is why we have it. And so and once again we come full circle to mothers and parents, but women and femininity in general, what we pass on, how much influence we might have, not just as mothers, but as human beings in the world. This is important.
Yes.
The engagement and fragmentation of people's lives also prevents that, because
Yes.
people, you could be influencing lots of people beyond your own daughter, if we were not fragmented from one another, if community and communal kind of stewardship of each other's progeny is not discouraged. So it seems like every conversation we have eventually lands in this place.
Well, I think it's beautiful. It's always the best place to conclude.
It is the best place. But of course, because we're speaking about Gaza, and I don't want to not end on that note. I want to mention the name of that town, which is called by the Zionist entity as Derot, which is a settlement where they watched these, but the Palestinian name is nudged, perhaps end there, that there are Palestinian places and indigenous names for an indigenous population, for the land on which they lived and where they conducted their existence and passed down their traditions and culture to good end.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I always love it. I mean, you could be like my weekly guest.
We have so much fun. I know. Why don't they give us a show on prime time?
Exactly.
The World According to Rue and Eurydice.
Yeah. I love it.
It would be a hit.
And everyone out there, until next week, keep speaking peace, not war. And when necessary, speak genocide.
Yes, say it loud.
Still my